Alright you guys, it's finally here. This is your next Q&A. As always, you guys send in a lot of good questions. If I didn't get you on this one, I'm going to try to get you on the next one. We got a lot of questions, so let's get straight to it. So Mario Ramirez wants to know, war stories and inner demons are amazing. Seeing as how you have a lot of relationships with other old NF members, maybe your inner demons could be like a season 1 and you could get others to start season 2. Hearing their story from a youngster all the way up until now and get others to do the same. Well. I like the idea and it probably would make for a good series, but there's two issues that come to mind when I think about running a series like that. Obviously, the first thing that would make it a little complicated is how to compensate someone like that for their time and effort. Time is a commodity, so I would obviously have to pay for someone to do something like that. And don't get me wrong, I don't have a problem for paying anyone for their time and effort. That's not the problem. The problem is that it wouldn't generate enough money in order for it to make sense, and also for me to be able to absorb the potential investment. People are probably under the impression that some of the series I do, like Inner Demons and War Stories, are generating a lot of money and that they do well financially. I wish that was true, but that's just not the case. I've talked about this before in some of my lives, but I'm not into YouTube for the financial gain. That's not what I do it for. If it was, I'd be doing things that would get me a lot more views. Things like getting into the drama and saturating YouTube with a lot more videos. Anyone that understands the numbers and knows how YouTube works would be able to look at the views on my channel and figure out that my channel is not generating a lot of money. I do what I do because I like to entertain the people who tap in, and it's just something that I invest myself in because I genuinely like doing it. So the financial side of it is one part. The other thing is that there's a lack of potential candidates who I'd be willing to use. You were correct. I do know a lot of older guys who were part of that game, but I really don't know that many former NF members who I'd be willing to use. Two things come to mind. One, I'm very selective of who I bring on my channel because I feel like anyone you decide to bring on the platform that you created is a direct reflection of you. I've said this before, but as content creators, we're all responsible and accountable for who we bring on our channel and the message that they convey. You can't bring someone on, let them run amok, and then try to separate yourself. It don't work like that. The other thing involves transparency. I don't want individuals coming onto my platform that can't be transparent or who refuse to be honest about their past. For me, that's important and it's a mandatory requirement. The way I see it is like this. If you can't keep it real all the way around the board and be honest about things you've done in your past, everything, then I won't mess with you. I'm not going to allow someone to come on and talk themselves up about who they were, about the positions they held, and about all the things that are going to make them look good, but then allow them to bend the truth in other aspects of their story. I can't respect that, period. So with all that said, there really isn't that many people who are willing to be transparent or who can live up to these policies. Again, I like your idea and I wish things were different, but it is what it is, and there just isn't that many potential candidates that would make this a series. So Tech to Roscoe, your opinion on hitting rivals' houses, like pulling up to some fool's parents' house and lighting it up. That's a no-no to me, but was or is there a rule pertaining to that? Pertaining to an unwritten moral rule? Yes. An implemented written rule or policy? It depends on who you ask and what or how it's interpreted. In our old street activities, the policies and procedures that we used to train all those who were destined to the streets and who had made a commitment to function in the street regiments, there was a subsection that specifically said that our families, our wives, our kids, etc., were supposed to be looked at and embraced as our purest reflections of us and who we are as a familia. Therefore, we hold them to a higher standard. We treat them with the utmost level of respect, cariño, both in words and in deeds. Now, I'm sure there are going to be a lot of those that are going to manipulate that and leave it open for interpretation. But to me, it's pretty clear. Does this stop or change when someone falls in bad standings? I don't think so. But then again, you're going to have those that are going to twist this up and run with it. They're going to say that there's no rules of engagement when it comes to defectors or all those that have fallen in bad graces. That anything and everything's fair game when it comes to how we deal with them. I don't agree with this notion. Although we might grow to despise and resent these individuals, I don't think that this means it's okay for us to lose sight of our standards or our moral compasses. I personally have never believed in going after the families or loved ones of those who became targets, and this isn't the way I was schooled. This applies to defectors and opposition of any kind. Families, be it mothers, sisters, brothers, wives, and especially kids, are just off limits. The concept of hitting someone where it hurts the most is understandable, especially when you can't get those individuals themselves. But I still don't agree that this justifies compromising your standards. We've got to also keep in mind that what we do and how we operate is always being scrutinized. Prime examples are incidents like the Maxon Street murders in El Monte and the recent murders that just happened in Goshen. In both of these incidents, mothers and their young children were slaughtered by gang members who were acting under the guise of the Mexican Mafia and the Nuestra Familia. It was neither of these two organizations' intentions on getting caught up in messy cases that involved the killing of infants and babies, but because they had enlisted the assistance of loose cannons, they ended up catching the media's wrath. So in short order, Tech, no, I don't believe it's okay to victimize any rival's families, whether it involves pulling up on their houses and lighting it up, using fear tactics to extort them or victimize them in any way, shape, or form based on a relative falling in bad standings. So Everlasting Base wants to know, how do you think dudes on death row are living nowadays? Well, you definitely asked the right person, because I spent a lot of time with them guys in the 90s in both East Block and the Adjustment Center. I actually got the opportunity not only to be housed on the tiers with death row inmates, but I was also assigned to a yard with validated BGF and NF condemned inmates. To be honest with you, I started looking forward to being housed in places like the Adjustment Center, because as an ADSEG inmate, we had it good over there. Once we hit the tier, we got blessed by everybody. Every time I was there in the 90s, I had a radio, sweats, thermals, canteen, and pretty much everything else that they allowed these guys to have. Guys like myself, Mikeo from Salinas, Chico from Salinas, Lucky from San Jose, Brown Bob from Morgan Hill, and others were all housed over there because we were either identified as being shot callers or guys who had too much influence. So as far as the living conditions on death row, it just depends on who it is you're talking about. California's death row is spread out. They're all over the place, and for the most part, the majority of them have a lot of the same privileges and incentives as any other mainline inmate. You have a small housing unit that sits on top of North Block in San Quentin that's called North SAG. This is synonymous to an honor unit. These guys have a lot of freedom and more privileges than the average death row inmate. In order to get housed there, they basically have to conduct themselves like model inmates and remain disciplinary free forever. Then they have East Block, which is basically death row's mainline. This is where the majority of California's grade A death row inmate is housed. Anyone that's been to Quentin knows that living in those cells is literally like living in a closet. The cells are small. But aside from living in a small confined cell like the ones in Quentin, believe it or not, these guys have a lot of latitude. They can have typewriters, jewelry, musical instruments, TVs, radios, art and hobby supplies, and a pretty extensive canteen list. They even let these guys have contact visits, and this in itself comes with a lot of perks. So under the circumstances, and for being on death row, they live relatively comfortable. Now in 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom and the state of California elected to impose a moratorium on the death penalty. This was all in conjunction with the governor's plan to eventually dismantle and abolish death row. The governor then introduced Proposition 66, a voter-approved initiative that required death row inmates to be transferred to general population mainlines so that they could work and pay restitution to their victims. Despite a lot of pushback from death row proponents accusing the governor of exploiting a section of the initiative for his own ideological and political purposes, this pilot program is still in effect. The death row inmates that were selected to take part in this program are basically enjoying the same freedoms as any other mainline inmate out there. They live on the same tiers with them, they get to partake in some of the same programs, they get to go out to the yards, and they get the same privileges as everyone else. The other death row inmates that were left behind in San Quentin are hoping that it continues to expand, and they're depending on these guys who are in the pilot program to basically demonstrate that the program is successful and that death row inmates can conform to these types of programs. I think the only death row inmates that got it bad are the ones who are housed in the adjustment center. The adjustment center used to be the spot to go. Like I said, I used to look forward to going there myself. But after several officers got sliced up and assaulted, that all stopped and they flipped the whole unit. They came in and put up solid doors, they shut down the group yards and put in what they call dog cages. And they basically just beefed up security in there to the point to where it's all bad now. Now they only house death row inmates exclusively over there. It's basically death row's whole or shoe program. The only ones that get housed over there are guys that are validated, guys that assault other inmates or staff, or new death row inmates who are required to go through the adjustment center as a part of their death row transition. So Upper Left Cali wants to know, being that you stayed in the Bay Area after you got out, can you speak on if you ran into any actives who knew you from the NF days? I've been through my neighborhood several times throughout the years, and I never had issues with anyone from my neighborhood. I wasn't ducking or dodging either. I went out there and strolled through my hood like I used to. And I'm not saying that like I'm trying to be tough or like I can't be touched either, because I honestly didn't know how it was going to be received. I just went out there with my head on a swivel, because even though I knew better, I heard there were some people who were running their mouths. On the reals though, I think a lot of that stuff just depends on who you are, how you conduct yourself, and how people see you out there. If you're lame and you carry yourself like one, then that's how people are going to come at you, and that's how you're going to be treated. There's a lot of people from my neighborhood who don't care about prison or prison politics. People who I have solid relationships with, and people who just understand that there's more to life than prison. I have had a couple situations out there, but they didn't happen in my neighborhood. I've already talked about what happened on one of those occasions in an episode of War Stories, and I'll eventually tell you guys what happened in future episodes. So David Avila wants to know, what was the highest NF category status Lencho held? It just bewilders me that the NF held such a loose cannon in high regards as long as they did with this individual. You ain't lying, boy. Lencho was bumped up to a Cat 2 during the late 90s. Although we were in different blocks at the time he was elevated, I was there with him when he was bumped up. To be completely honest with you guys, getting elevated to a Cat 2 is practically a formality for a lot of C's. There's a lot of older C's who used to rubber stamp Cat 2s for the sole purpose of prepping or priming them up to be their regimental commanders after they paroled. They didn't technically earn it like they were supposed to. It was given to them as a prerequisite for an RC position. In other words, there would be a lot of new C's who were getting ready to parole, and during this time, they would be undergoing the indoctrination process that involved rigorous street training. The primary objective was to just have a qualified C who was getting ready to parole and who was prepared to step out into an RC position. And although it wasn't mandated, one of the requirements of appointing an RC was that it was a C who held the status of a Cat 2. So what I'm basically trying to say is that acquiring the status of a Cat 2 is probably the easiest status to acquire, and more often than not, it's done for serving ulterior purposes such as this. There wasn't really no checks and balances in place for this, and just as there were a multitude of problems that were identified as being problematic for the NRCAT system, this was one that existed for the NF. I don't think I need to go over all the different reasons about why Lencho was a tyrant and why he fits this description to a T. But just trust me when I tell you that schooling wasn't one of his strong suits. Hearing Lencho break down a section of the Constitution or hearing him give instruction to the NR members was comical. This is why he never used to participate. Bottom line, this dude was able to slip and slide his way through for years. He was able to navigate his way through his entire career, and this is probably one of his only real achievements that he deserves to be credited with. So Watson, Valiente 831 wants to know, have you ever worked hand in hand with any NF or active Norteños from Watsonville? If so, who? And what was your experience like working with these individuals? Yes, I have. Oscar Baby Joker Cabrera, Javier Pelon Martinez, and Tomas Chopo McIntosh are 3 C's who I've worked with in the past. Others I've had minor dealings with were Albert Doughboy Martinez, Freddie Danger Guzman, and Anthony Tigre Rubalcaba. I've only worked with Chopo behind the walls, but I've worked with both BJ and Pelon on the streets. As far as my experience with these individuals, I'm just gonna say this. Working with homeboys from Watsonville and those surrounding areas out there was similar to working with homeboys from Salinas. I always clicked with the brothers from these areas because of how they were gamed up and because of how they conducted themselves. They have a different mentality, and I work better with people I can identify with. If you're someone who has watched or listened to a lot of my content, then you should already know that I have an extensive amount of experience with Baby Joker. We've known each other for years, and we have a lot of history together. One of the memories that always stands out to me when I think about BJ is when me and my second in command found tracking devices under our cars. And I called BJ to tell him that I needed him to come out to San Jose, where I was living at that time, so I could relay some hot, important information to him. Needless to say, I didn't want to tell him over the phone. When we spoke, he told me that he needed to relay something important back to me and that he'd be out there to see me ASAP. When he came out to my house the following day, he brought his second in command with him. I believe at that time it was either Tigre or Danger. It was comical. As I started to tell him about the tracking devices and how me and Pony, my second in command, found them, he damn near passed out and was in a state of disbelief. That's when he told me that this was the same thing that he had intended on relaying to me, that they had found tracking devices on their vehicles as well. It was just a crazy twist of fate how it all happened and how both regiments had found out that we had been infiltrated by law enforcement at the same time. This should have been a blessing in disguise for all of us, that we had seen this coming before they struck and took us all down. But unfortunately, it didn't go down like that. When this was all filtered out to leadership, instead of telling us to shut it down and to disperse, we were instead told to tighten it up so that their only real objective or concern could be accomplished, to keep the money coming. What's up, Machete? So Machete wants to know, you mentioned how the 5 vatos would be received, embraced, sabotaged, or just outright removed permanently. Machete, what's up, boy? I'm assuming that you're referring to the 5 remaining defendants in Operation Quiet Storm, correct? My guess is as good as yours, my dude, but let me just say this. According to everything I know and according to everything that I've seen transpire over the course of these last couple of years, I would have to say that those who they believe are more culpable of fueling that conflict and creating the rift are on borrowed time. You obviously have your leaders and your followers, right? Those distinctions should be easy enough to make. Then you have your instigators and those who are being accused of helping to make the power plays. The same ones who made personal attacks on Skip and Corny. Those are easy calls. What do you think? By now, several of those guys have already been convicted and were already shipped off to the federal system. I'd be willing to bet that all those guys have been thoroughly interrogated and that they've pretty much been squeezed for all the pertinent information that the federal leadership needs in order to get a clear picture of who was doing what and who was responsible for creating all the chaos. So my guess is that the targets have already been made, and those who are going to catch a pass are going to catch a pass. Because think about it, if no one's held accountable and nothing's done, what does that say to all those who are watching? From both outsiders to those who are part of the collective. They clearly got to make some examples. So Skipto Peña wants to know, what if the opposition disposed of a weapon by sliding it under your cell? Is it possible to be no good to the NF but be good in your neighborhood? I feel like this is a scenario that has parts missing, so let me throw a few real situations out there that come to mind. This actually happened in Susanville after the Sureños did a removal on one of their own. Baby Joker from Hazard moved on another Sureño that allegedly made statements in a murder that had just taken place on the 2-yard. I don't know if this was a result of a lack of planning or foresight, or if they just did this removal on the spur of the moment. But either way, they slid the weapon under our door and didn't have any other means of getting rid of it. What do you do, or what did I do in that situation? I did what any real convict would have done. I assisted them by disposing of the weapon. At that point, it wasn't about them being the opposition. It was about assisting another convict and doing what I could to get rid of the weapon. The gun tower obviously seen the weapon go under my door, so I had to get rid of it. Otherwise, I might have kept it. Like I said, there's scenario after scenario, and the possibilities are endless. But that's how I would deal with it. As far as whether or not someone could be no good in prison, but still good in their neighborhood, believe it or not, this is something that happens a lot. Again, every scenario is different, but this depends on a number of different things. One of the main things it's going to depend on is how much influence the NF and the NR has in that neighborhood. Let's take places like Salinas or San Jose, for example. These are cities that the NF has always had a strong presence and influence in. The streets are more likely to honor prison politics in places like this over other areas like Humboldt County or Livermore, where the presence is a lot more thinned out. Another thing that might factor in is if there's a functioning regiment in that city. The street gangs in the neighborhoods are then subjected to a level of influence by those politics and things such as someone's status or if they're in bad standings. In situations like this, they're more likely to be honored. Then again, sometimes tribal loyalty is stronger than prison politics. There's areas like San Francisco, Oakland, and other small Bay Area cities like Hayward and Decoto that refuse to be swayed by prison politics or the organizations that control them. I'm not saying that these cities are anti-NF. However, some neighborhoods in these cities have openly demonstrated in the past that they're more susceptible to not always being in line with them. They tend to view these prison movements or these prison organizations as interlopers, someone who puts prison politics and capital gain before the neighborhood or above tribal loyalty. Sometimes when you grow up with homeboys from your hood and you've been in the trenches with these guys, these bonds and these relationships end up being stronger than what goes on behind the walls in prison. On the flip side, I think that one of the other things that definitely factors in is if you also have a high presence of defectors or dropouts in these areas. The influence might be localized, but it still exists nonetheless. So Juan Carlos wants to know, why do criminal groups always have to fake the morality with not killing women and children? They have no problem ruining their lives by stealing from them, scamming them, or even feeding their addictions. But stop short and think it's some kind of line they won't cross to kill them. That's a good question. Perception. It's all about perception. It's important to be looked at as a criminal organization that stands for things that are socially acceptable. Helping the people, protecting and taking care of the less fortunate, giving back to the communities, and being a criminal organization that has clear standards and stands against all the things you mentioned. Organized crime, distribution of narcotics, and even killing rivals are things most, if not all, criminal organizations are involved in. That's what they do. And even then, sometimes these things are hard sells themselves. But criminal organizations don't want to be associated with certain things that aren't socially acceptable. Killing women and children, destroying people's lives, and feeding their addictions are just a few of the obvious. The NF and the MA are two criminal organizations that take great pride in letting it be known that they don't believe in killing women and kids, even if it's in the process of collateral damage. Again, this brings us back to situations like the Maxon Road murders in El Monte and the recent killings that took place in Goshen, California. As soon as the incidents took place, these organizations took great strides in letting the public know that this wasn't acceptable, that it wasn't part of the plan, and that they would punish all those that were involved. The Goshen incident is still fresh and just barely took place, but for those of you who remember, the MA administered its own form of justice by killing Character, one of the Sangre gang members that was involved in that incident. So the fake morality you mentioned is important because it is part of conforming to the general public's belief system. It's in line with what's acceptable, and again, it's important because these criminal organizations want to be accepted. They want to be embraced. The Hells Angels is a perfect example of a criminal organization that goes above and beyond the norm to convince the public that it's involved in the type of activities that are not deemed criminal. Charity events, toy giveaways, and helping the impoverished are all things done for the purpose of spinning that image. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman is another crime figure that invests considerable time and resources in building his image. In his country, he's looked at as being a form of a modern-day Robin Hood. He gave a lot of money to people who were poor and hungry. He had members of his cartel, the Sinaloa cartel, take food into some of the poorest communities and feed the people. This was all done to win support, and it worked, despite the fact that these same cartel members have slaughtered women and children in the past. So in short order, I think it all comes down to image and perception and being in line with what's socially acceptable. So, Dacha Holiday 1979 wants to know, or wants to give a profile idea. I'm sure you've heard of him, Jose Luis Sainz, aka Smiley from Cuatro Flats, aka Toro from the Tijuana cartel. He has the craziest gangster life I've come across. I appreciate the profile idea. This is a good idea, and I'm gonna see what I can come up with for a future profile. I did manage to read up on a little about Smiley from Cuatro Flats and Toro from the Tijuana cartel, and it is a crazy story. Again, thank you for pointing me in that direction. So Juan Carlos again wants to know, how did you handle dealing with homies that were not all there? Either because they were burnt out, or were just slow, or they just weren't that very smart at all. Well, look at this poster boy right here. Very carefully. On the real, it's funny that you asked that question, because I did have to deal with individuals who fit this description. One in particular was in the very last regiment I ran out in San Jose. Angel Young Buck Martinez from Goshen was somebody who worked under me. And to be honest with you, the only reason I tolerated him was because of his brother, Martin Sykes Martinez. Angel was a burnout. His drug of choice was KJ, but this dude basically dabbled in whatever he could get his grimy hands on. I'm not trying to slander the dude's character, because there was a time when I did like him. But working with him was like working with a special needs person. He was slow, he obviously wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, and I didn't have a whole lot of confidence in him. But I tried utilizing him where I could. As a regimental commander, you have to be able to adapt to different characters, and you have to be able to relate to them on different levels. Angel was just a different character to work with. I literally had to implement different safeguards whenever I had to deal with him. Instead of giving him the same amount of regimental dope on consignment, which sometimes would be up to 10 ounces, I would instead give him a couple of 8 balls. If you guys remember, he was one of the guys I had stationed at one of my apartments in Campbell for the sole purpose of keeping security on that location. Needless to say, he failed and didn't even get a shot off when I got into that shootout. In retrospect, he got a lot of extra latitude and technically should have been deemed for either things he did or didn't do. If anyone else would have done some of the things he did, they would have been done. He got away with a lot, but like I said, it was because of his brother Sykes, who was one of the only C's who I had working with me. I've dealt with other guys like Jeffrey Soldier Boy Roscoe, who was also in my regiment and wasn't that bright either. Everybody's different, but I've had to deal with other guys in other regiments who were also either slow or lacked common intelligence, and this usually just dictated how I used them or what I would use them for. So Frankenstein OG wants to know, how did you change from one lifestyle to the now? One step and one day at a time. Slow motion, my boy. I had to readapt and reacclimate myself to living in a different way and on different terms. It's a transition like everything else. I was so used to living my life in the criminal element and making fast money that I'm still trying to get used to doing things the honest way. Am I fully rehabilitated and completely removed from that lifestyle? If I said yes, I'd be lying. It's a struggle every day that I wake up to. I still have to fight back the thoughts of hitting the quick lick. I still have to remind myself that I'm just one step away from spending the rest of my life in prison. Aside from all the strikes I have on my record, I got stacked with a bunch of priors when I got sentenced for my last criminal case, so I can't allow myself to lose sight of these types of things. People give up on guys like me. When you turn 30 or 40 and you're still involved in criminal activity, they look at you as an incorrigible, a throwaway, someone who's beyond the point of redemption. This country's criminal justice system is designed to redeem criminals at an age that they deem manageable. This is somewhere between 14 and 25. In their eyes, if you haven't turned the corner by then they wash their hands of you and consider you a lost cause. I'm a walking, talking, living example of someone who defied this philosophy. And if I can do it, then anyone can do it. It's all about making the right decisions and remaining focused on what happens if I decide to make the wrong decisions. So Pete Lamelli wants to know, I've been listening for a while and respect that you don't try to change your story, though it has changed so much now for the good. But back in the late 80s and 90s, the connections of car clubs and hood beliefs. These connections not only showed up in the streets, cruises, but also at the show. Just figured I'd give you another topic for a rainy day. Thank you, Pete. As a longtime viewer, I respect you and the opinions you make. Yeah, social media is like a big media fingerprint. That's what a lot of these guys don't understand that do change up their stories. Everything's recorded and can be cross-referenced. Some of these guys start out with good intentions and really have a desire to be forthright. But as they recreate themselves and become social media characters, they forget about this when they try to go back and clean the shit they stepped on off the bottom of their shoe. Unfortunately for them, people aren't as stupid as they think they are, and people really do listen. Anyways, as for the connections between the car clubs, the cruises, and the shows, this is definitely a topic that I'll keep in mind for a future show. Again, thank you for your candor, for your opinions, and of course, for your ideas. So Barber King 6616 wants to know, have you ever had anyone you recruited turn on you? Maybe you should have asked, have you ever recruited anyone that hasn't turned on you? Absolutely. For whatever reason, in this game it seems like these are the first ones to turn on you. This is how it's always been. The ones you recruit, assist, and look out for are the first ones to turn on you and stab you in the back. Your proteges are also the ones that end up wanting to see your undoing. I don't know what it is about the Norteño people and the spirit of the movement that this is predicated on, but I've seen it happen time and time again. Look at Maquillo from Salinas. Two of his proteges would end up sabotaging him and ultimately wanted to become him. They wanted it so bad that they were willing to put a bullet in his head so that they could be the ones who could later claim that they're the ones responsible for wiping out his legacy. There's something taboo about taking out the people who helped create you, almost as if it validates some crazy idea in their mind that they were stronger than you. When I went through my trials and tribulations in the Santa Clara County Jail, all those brothers that I either helped or savaged at one time or another were the first ones to jump on the bandwagon and turn on me. Another prime example of someone that turned on me after I recruited them and saved them from what would have been a certain removal is Jesse Conejo Rodriguez from EHP. I'm actually going to be mentioning the details of what he did in my next episode of Inner Demons, but in a nutshell, this is what happened. Conejo was functioning in another regiment and had pretty much gotten himself in a bind behind a lot of money he was in debt for. I didn't know him or anything about him, but because several members of my regiment spoke up for him and asked me to help him, that's what I ultimately did. That's just the kind of C I was, and that's how I've always been. Long story short, after throwing this guy a lifeline, clearing up his problems, and then agreeing to take responsibility for him, that's what I did. I brought him in on board and started working with him. Without going into the intricate details, let me just say this. 4 months after putting him on, I ended up being the main target in a multi-agency investigation. My house, as well as 12 other houses that were all associated with me, were all raided in conjunction with this investigation. And then in the end, I found myself in the Santa Clara County Jail looking at a life case after getting hit with a 46-count indictment that was initiated behind Conejo's testimony in front of an impaneled grand jury. Like I said, if you want to know more, check out my latest episode of Inner Demons and you'll get all the details. So yes, I've definitely been stung by those that I've either helped or recruited in the past. So Alonzo Vera 00 wants to know, why was Conejo deemed and stripped of his power? Good question. James Conejo Perez from Sacra was stripped and demoted of his street authority due to a number of reasons that are related to several street regiments that he was entrusted to oversee. Where should I start? There was a little bit of everything involved. Everything from frivolous misconduct, overstepping his authority, misappropriation of organizational monies, unauthorized dealings with other regimental members, interference in another padrino's street affairs, and spreading false and misleading propaganda. To be honest, Conejo caught a break by being stripped and having his status relegated to a Cat 1, because he technically could have been whacked and it would have been justified. I was under Conejo from 1994 until around 1998. In 1994, I ended up landing in C5 on a parole violation. Before paroling again in early 1995, I celled up with Louis Big Rocha Roche, another C from my neighborhood, who was then reassigned to work under the direction of Conejo. Prior to this, I was under another C who was overseeing San Francisco, Oakland, and other parts of the East Bay and Santa Rosa. So Conejo was my channel and direct link for almost 5 years. I'm not going to go as far as calling him a tyrant, because at that time, he wasn't pulling a lot of the shady moves he later get accused of pulling, and to be honest, I thought he was a stand-up type of guy. In the early 90s, he was appointed to act as one of the padrinos under one of the old street formats, and this is when he was delegated some authority on the streets. Leadership in the Bay had just undergone a litany of changes. This was sparked following the defection of Vincent Big Chente Arroyo from Chino Sinners and the removal of Ralph Old Man Rafa Rubio from Fresno. Other contributing factors came into play when Joseph Pinky Hernandez from Cucamonga was indicted by a Santa Clara County grand jury, and as a result passed his position over to Gerald Cuete Rubalcaba from Tulare County. Robert Brown Bob Viramontes also paroled, which only added more chaos to the shakeup. This is around the time when Conejo started to take more of a proactive role with leadership, and more specifically, the street affairs. From the onset, Conejo started overstepping his boundaries and started interfering with other street regiments. As is the case with a lot of C's, they get put in a position of power, and after getting the taste of it, they end up doing too much too fast. That's basically where Conejo started to go on a downward spiral. I remember we opened up a separate investigation that involved him and misappropriation of unaccounted for money. Unfortunately, the investigation ended up bearing no fruit, as the main individuals involved ended up defecting. From there, it just continued to escalate. In the end, there was a general consensus amongst the OGB, organizational governing body, that Conejo was creating too many problems and that he was ultimately becoming a liability. At that point, it then went to the GC, the General Counsel, who took a formal vote calling for his demotion and permanent disqualification of street authority. That was a serious undertaking, to say the least. In order to be permanently disqualified from ever being involved in street regiment business is serious. All this was meted out pre-Operation Black Widow, when Corny, Pinky, Skip, Stort, DC, and Tibbs were still there. He was well aware of these consequences and knew what those consequences entailed. This is why there was such an uproar about how he manipulated himself back into the leadership circle after all these C's were shipped out post-Operation Black Widow. He did it in their absence, knowing that these sanctions were voted on and that this effectuation was still in place. To convolute things even more, you add insult to injury when you think about all the high crimes he's accused of committing out on the main lines when he really shouldn't have been in the position he hijacked. So Nix 1483 wants to know, how and when did you become a C? I entered the prison system for the first time in 1989 doing my first term, a 7-year bid for 4 strong-arm robberies. Not long after I landed there, I was approached about becoming a member of the NR, the Nuestra Raza. I obviously expressed a desire to become a member of this movement, so at that point, I was then placed on a 90-day probationary period. My sponsor and recruiter were James Sotelo and Paul Puerto Rican Puppet Olivencia, both from San Jose. Needless to say, when I caught a chain out of San Quentin, which was the reception center at that time, I left there as a full-fledged member of the NR. My career with the NR spanned over a 6-year period, and in 1991, I was validated as a member of the NR for participating in a group stabbing. In 1994, after close to 6 years of functioning as an NR member, I was approached in San Quentin by two high-ranking NF members about taking that final step and becoming a member of the mob. This was the moment I had been waiting for. After becoming an NR member and honorably functioning within that movement, I couldn't see myself stopping there. From that point on, my purpose was to just continue elevating, to continue climbing the ranks until I reached that pinnacle. In 1994, that opportunity finally came. Two high-ranking NF members were passing through San Quentin on a fluke, and both of these C's were on a recruiting blitz. Art Big Smiley Ramirez and Mike MC Castillo, both from Salinas, were two C's who brought me into the familia. Again, I was placed on a 90-day probationary period, and at that point, the recruitment process started all over again. Besides myself, I was recruited in a group class that consisted of Vincent Chente Garcia, Rico Smiley Garcia, Cesar Lobo Ramirez, all from Salinas, and Gerald Oso Winston from Santa Rosa. Needless to say, we all made the cut, and in late 1994, I hit the streets as a fully functioning member of the NF. So Bradford Barding wants to know, did you and your regiment ever make profits for yourselves pushing NF dope? Of course, it had to be profitable for us. We weren't just mules for the NF, as we had bills to pay too. Over the years, I've seen the street format change several times. This consisted of the protocols, the policies, procedures, and basically the template we were following. And although there were a lot of different revisions, the titles and leadership structure constantly changed and we continued to evolve with the times, the numbers always basically stayed the same. When we functioned in the regiments, 25% of all the criminal activities we were involved in went to the organization's main bank. If we were involved in robberies, slinging dope, extortion, and other forms of criminal activities, 25% of that came off the top and went back as a contribution. Another requirement was the $200 monthly that all members were required to pay monthly. This was a mandatory commission that's been around forever. These were the only kickbacks that we were required to contribute. However, as time went on and the books started to be scrutinized a lot closer, almost to the point of micromanagement, set quotas were set, and this was all based on a sliding scale. The size of the regiment, how many members the regiment consisted of, the level of criminal activity the regiment was involved in, and how well established things were all became factors. There was still room to make a profit, but now instead of kicking back $2,000 to $3,000, we were kicking back $7,000 to $8,000. Money definitely came a focal point, and things started getting managed a lot tighter as time went on. But as a regimental commander, I gave my manpower a lot of latitude to sell their own dope on the side. I had to. If it wasn't profitable for them, who's gonna work in these regiments? When I'd buy all the drugs at wholesale prices from our connection, I'd give my manpower action at those same prices, and this was a lot cheaper than they could find anywhere else. My only requirement when all the dope would go out is that they all dump the regiment dope first. After that, they were free to get off whatever they had. This kept them happy. I think it was on those of us who were appointed as the regimental commanders to devise these types of effective methods in order to maintain some harmony and to basically do what we needed to do in order to keep the game fair and profitable, not only for ourselves and for the O, but also for the manpower too. So Shannon E. here wants to know, high control parole is for gang members, sex offenders, right? Yes, Shannon, high control parole was reserved primarily for validated gang members, sex offenders, and inmates who had a high propensity for committing acts of violence. Those are the three categories that qualified inmates for high control parole. So Knowledge is Power wants to know, like to hear more about marching, the unity. Marching in the days when we used to demonstrate the solidarity and unity we had on the infamous 6 yard started to fizzle out in the mid-90s. Back in those days, the Norteño Collective probably peaked out and was the strongest it ever was. The NR ranks were packed out, the NF was strong, and the unity between us and the Africanos was solid. Every time we went out to the yard, we would fall into formation and wait until the last man made it out. Then we started our yard off with a traditional 3-lap march. I can't emphasize enough how loud it was and how much of a spectacle it was to watch it as it was happening. There was 6 yards back there behind East Block. 4 of those yards were death row and the other 2 were ADSEG. When the marching and the cadence started, every last one of those other 5 yards stopped dead in their tracks, and they all looked over to catch a glimpse of it. Most of the time, we'd only get to the second lap before the administration would come out and demand for us to stop. It was that loud. Their position was that we were promoting gang activity and that we were employing intimidation tactics through our exercises. There was a period of time that we were going at it with the administration, and it had escalated to the point to where we actually had to hold the yard hostage. We refused to stop and refused to allow them to dictate what types of exercises we did on our yard. A lot of us ended up getting shipped out. Some of us got placed on walk alone, and others got moved out to the adjustment center. All because we refused to comply with the way they were trying to dictate our yard. After we would refuse to stop, they would come out and try to run us back in to the unit. But we told everybody out there to just keep doing our exercises. Their next move would be to tell us to all get down on the ground and prone out. We sat down, but we refused to prone out. And it was at that point that we just sit there and refused to come in, holding the yard hostage. Eventually, they would send out the assistant warden or a high-ranking captain and attempt to negotiate with us just to call it a day and to come back inside. After a couple of hours of going back and forth with them, we'd eventually agree to go back inside. All this took place in the mid-90s, and then over the course of time, the marching and the days of sounding off on those inspirational cadence calls just came to an end. So Mario Gonzalez 5693 wants to know, did you guys have the Bay Area locked up like the only dope being moved was yours? If not, they had to pay taxes. You mean locked down? I've been the regimental commander for San Francisco several times throughout the 90s, and I can tell you now that we've never been able to lock down the city. It was doable in other places like Salinas, San Jose, and Santa Rosa, but it's never been done in the city. There was just too much diversity out there, too many different groups, too many different areas that were hard to infiltrate, and the schematics were just too spread out to lock it down like that. In order to lock a city like Frisco down, you'd have to have a good amount of people spread out, working in different parts of the city, and it would have to be a coordinated effort. Places like Salinas and San Jose were easy to lock down because the areas we had to establish were localized and contained to a few small areas like Chinatown and the tracks. The other thing that helped was that the NF had widespread influence out there. It wouldn't have been possible without that. This is something we were never able to establish in the city. Our influence was limited. This is because the mentality is a little different out in the city, and the Norteños out there have a different agenda. So Ben Franklin 972 wants to know, when you went back to San Jose, did you have to start collecting money from all the hoods out there? We gotta pay monthlies, each homie from our hoods. Where does it go? I feel like I'm owed a refund check about now. Laugh out loud. There's no trickle-down effect, it's a trickle-up effect. That money, it stays at the top. It's supposed to go to the less fortunate, the guys in prison that don't have nobody taking care of them. But as long as I've been around, I've never seen that money divvied up and sent to anybody that needed it. That's real talk. But this is something that Chuco and his minions invented. I personally never taxed the streets this way. When I first heard about this and how it was being implemented, I just shook my head. I guess the street regiments weren't generating enough money, so this was Chuco's way to compensate for the difference and squeeze more money out of the people. In my opinion, this is just another setback and another relegation that confirms that the state leadership is still moving in the wrong direction. I hope you guys enjoyed this Q&A. I know it's been a while since we dropped our last Q&A, but we're going to start incorporating them back into our regular lineup again. With that said, I want to thank everyone who submitted questions and all those of you who continue to support the channel. I know that the content has been a little spotty and that we haven't been putting out a lot, but just continue to stick with us and we'll get back to doing things the way we were. You guys have stuck with us through the bumps, the obstacles, and all the other things that we've had to overcome. This is no different, so just bear with us. Lastly, I want to extend my appreciation to those of you who have given this channel its props for remaining drama and sucker free. We take pride in the fact that we don't indulge in the petty drama and that we're not part of that sideshow. So again, we appreciate all our viewers and everything that you guys do to support us, as we realize that without you, we would cease to exist.